Hi, I'm Mark from eReplacementParts.com. In this video, I'm going to show you how to replace the battery wiring harness on your Black and Decker CST1200 string trimmer. I'll start by removing one side of the housing handle. It's secured with a series of screws. With the screws removed, now I'll split open the two sides of the housing. With the housing removed, you want to be careful. Because this is a battery-operated unit, all of the wiring is still live at this point. So what I want to do is remove the connection at the top of the battery and wrap some electrical tape around it to isolate it from the rest of the wiring. That way you can't accidentally turn on the trimmer while you're working on it. Now I'll remove the lock button and the lock button spring. Now I'll remove the actuator and the actuator spring. Before you remove any of the wiring, it's a good idea to take a picture or make a wiring diagram so you'll know where everything goes when you go to put it back together. I like to use my phone, and I'll just snap a couple of pictures to use as a reference. Now I'll remove the switch and disconnect the wires from the back of the switch. Now I'll remove the battery. Now I'll disconnect the battery wiring harness and remove it from the housing. And now I'll remove the other half of the handle housing. Now I'll remove the guard assembly. It's held in place with a single screw and a couple of plastic tabs. To remove the edge guide, I'll pry it back with a screwdriver. And then pull it away from the trimmer. Now I'll split the two sides of the motor housing. It's secured with a series of screws. I'll use a screwdriver to help split the two halves of the motor housing. Now I'll remove the motor and spindle shaft assembly from the housing and disconnect it from the wiring harness. It's connected to the wiring harness with a couple of small metal clips. I just use some needle nose pliers to pry those back. You can reuse these clips later, or the method I prefer is to solder this back together. We'll show you how to do that in a minute. Now I'll remove the tube assembly from the housing. And we can remove the dowel pin. The dowel pin holds tension on this spring, so I'll want to hold the spring back as I slide the pin out, and then carefully relieve the tension on the spring. Then I can pull the spring away from the tube. And now I'll pull the wiring harness from the tube. Now I'll replace the wiring harness. First I'll slide it through the tube. There is a top and a bottom to the tube. You can distinguish the bottom by the pin that sticks out of the tube. So I want the end of the harness with the wires for the motor to go through that end. Now replace the tube onto one half of the handle housing assembly. Now reinstall the battery wiring harness using the pictures that I took earlier as a reference. Now reinstall the white wire from the battery wiring harness to the negative side of the battery and insert the battery back into the housing. Now reconnect the wires to the switch and reinstall the switch into the housing. Now I can install the actuator compression spring onto the end of the actuator and reinstall the actuator and spring into the handle assembly. Now reinstall the lock button spring and the lock button. Now I can reinstall the opposite half of the handle housing. But before I do that, I want to take a minute and tuck away all of the wires so none of them get pinched when we put the two halves of the housing together. Also, I'll need to reconnect the positive side of the wiring harness to the battery. And I'll secure the housing with the screws. Now I'll replace the compression spring and secure it with the dowel pin. I pull the tension back on the spring and then insert the pin through the tube. Now I'll reattach the wiring harness to the motor assembly. Like I mentioned before, I like to solder this back on. So I'll put a little flux on the end of each wire, insert the wires through the eyelets on the motor, and then use the soldering iron to secure them. Now replace the motor and spindle shaft assembly back into the housing. I'll line up the tube assembly with the back side of the housing, and I need to pull this spring back so it clears the tabs on the housing, like that. Now replace the other half of the motor assembly and secure it with the screws. Now replace the edge guide. Now replace the guard assembly. And secure it with the screw. So as you can see, installing a new battery wiring harness is a simple repair you can do yourself. We hope you found this video helpful. Please feel free to leave a comment or ask us a question.